And live from Brussels, it's ZN Live. That's right. We are very excited today to have an expert and someone who's also an influencer, Paul Nemitz. He's been at the Commission for many decades and has been an expert at specific topics. Some call him the father of GDPR. And he's a co-founder of Mastodon EU Policy in Brussels. Well, it is an EU-focused channel. So, Paul, we're very happy to have you on the show. And I want to start with a question. What do you think is happening to Twitter in 2023? And how does that affect Mastodon, something that you've been discussing with us since last year, actually? So tell us what your thoughts are on Mastodon and Twitter.
Yeah, thank you, first of all, and for the opportunity to discuss a little bit. So Mastodon is a self-organized, decentralized social network. I think it has now around 7 or 8 million users, had a strong increase with the crisis at Twitter, with the craziness of Elon Musk coming into this company and thinking that communication without rules is just the right thing and what the world needs, where he's completely wrong, I would say. And so many people are worried what's happening to Twitter and are changing to Mastodon. Here in Brussels, we have created EU Policy Point Social. We were just 4 people in September, and I think by now we are close to 2,000 on this instance, which shows that there's a real wish to have an alternative ready in the pocket. This being said, at least me, I continue on Twitter, but everything I do on Twitter is now cross-posted, and I use a cross-poster program for this automatically on Mastodon. I look at Mastodon from time to time, but I still use Twitter more. We had a moment in December when under my instance, if you wanted to link to my instance on Twitter, I, for example, had put the Mastodon instance EU Policy Point Social into my profile. If you clicked on it, Twitter brought up a warning saying this is dangerous malware, and also it was not possible anymore at that time to put new Mastodon instances links on Twitter profiles. At that time, I was ready to bring a case against Twitter immediately. I talked to friends in New York in law firms, and people were just preparing the case. But I also talked to one friend in a law firm in New York who said, I can't bring the case. We are representing Twitter, actually, so we have a conflict. So I don't know what happened. Anyway, we were just ready to launch an injunction case against Twitter because, for me as a principal advisor in the European Commission, to have someone say that the instance I've set up on Mastodon is malware and dangerous, that's a problem. And I think it's outrageous. And anyway, all these blockages disappeared again within 2 or 3 days after having had this conversation. So that was good news. So if you ask me what's going to happen in 2023, honestly, I think it's impossible to forecast what Elon Musk is up to. One can hope that reason returns to Twitter, and that Twitter will be a social network which takes responsibility for a functioning democracy and for a public space in which reasonable discussions are possible, rather than hyping up all the extremes and all the harassing and hate speech, which one, of course, would see on social networks if there were no rules and if they wouldn't care. And sometimes Elon Musk sounds like this. he sounds sometimes extremely naive and gung-ho, what you expect from an American millionaire, but maybe he is able to learn that democracy requires some framework rules for a public space of debate, because if we don't have those rules, if the communication is only driven by advertising interests, namely by having more hype, because more hype means more click, it automatically also means that all the terrible things which create the hype, the hate, the pornography, the child pornography, what have you, all these things which may be commercially interesting but are terrible for society, that they are spread in an exponential way, in a viral way, while those who want to have reasonable discussions on where we should be going in our society are, minoritized and in the worst case, are harassed.
Yeah, I think you make a lot of very interesting points. I think the first thing is, which no one knows, as you said, is where is Twitter heading? I think that for the moment, it seems that the wave of driving the news cycle with very provocative tweets has slightly declined. So we're not seeing it as intensely as we saw it before. It's interesting you mentioned the advertisers, because a lot of them were kind of put off by that language, that kind of attitude towards allowing any kind of hate speech. So the question is, will Twitter return to some kind of balanced, more, let's say, sane management, or at least predictable one? Having said that, I think we see, as you said, that Twitter is still there and that people are still using Twitter as a platform. And at the same time, Mastodon has taken a new role. I mean, we've seen some influencers like Andrew Stroline, actually a lot of the journalists, a lot of people who've actually actively been using it have enjoyed the intimacy and the kind of newness of the community. So I think they're seeing that there was some engagement. Now that has, I think, diminished a little bit after in Jan, because I think people are just trying to decide where it's going to be. What do you see the role of Mastodon in the EU conversation? I mean, I think, as you said, you're there, but you're still actively on Twitter. Do you see this as taking a role maybe of more in-depth conversations, or do you have any ideas of where that might be heading?
Yes, I think the Mastodon instances, they permit to see two streams separated from each other. You can choose either to see the global stream of Mastodon or the local stream of Mastodon. And of course, let's say for those people who have a special interest in EU policy matters, if they choose the local stream of EU Policy Point Social, they get, undisturbed, a very clean stream of people who are also interested in this. And so I think it's very likely that the more insider discussion, the more concentrated discussion will move to Mastodon. Because in Twitter, there's just too much noise and too much dirt and annoyance, not to speak of the advertisement, of course, which we all now get, and where you wonder, why I am, for example, my stream is polluted and targeted with the defense industry, and I wonder why. So I think that would be my prediction for Mastodon. We are, in terms of who our web manager, Jan Penfrat from E3, the European Digital Rights Initiative, admits, I think, we're not having a colloquium on the people who apply, and we're not discussing it big time, but he looks a little bit whether the claim that, someone wants to be on EU Policy Social is real. So, we don't admit commercial placements, for example, and so I think it is probably a more concentrated and nicer and more in substance, also more substantial, more materially interesting conversation environment than much of the crud which you see on Twitter.
Yeah, it's a good point. I also see that when you post things on Mastodon, you get a lot more traction, even though your amount of followers might be a lot smaller. At the same time, Forbes wrote on January 25th that they expect a move, or they're already seeing a move from Twitter to LinkedIn, and that as a result, the conversation on LinkedIn is becoming much more human, and that they expect that platform to take over much of the traffic from Twitter. So is there really a need for Mastodon, or could LinkedIn potentially fill that void?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think it's good if there's a communication competition. And I would say, what I think is important for the press, namely that we have a mixture of privately financed press plurality, but also that we have a strong public television, which is publicly financed. We need both. And ideally also in the television market, a good mix between strong public TV and private TV. Plurality is good. But for me, it's also clear that commercial interests, wherever they are part of the communication environment, and if the companies themselves don't impose a severe discipline, they distort the nature of communication. And you can see that obviously, with tabloid press, where, just the money counts, not the truth. But of course, you have quality newspapers, which are these days also making money, at least some of them, by sticking to the journalistical ethos. So if you ask me the same question about social networks, I think grosso modo, we can say the same thing. There are some social networks who just plainly go for maximization of viral content, clickbait, and all that, including hate speech, incitement to violence, racism, and what have you, and harassment, all fine on my platform. Pornography, who cares? But they don't provide the communication environment. That will be the challenge to keep advertisers. I think the advertisers here have a great responsibility, and especially those advertisers who are proud of their mark and have to protect their mark. I think they must move away from these platforms. Now, is LinkedIn an alternative? Well, I think LinkedIn, I'm also on LinkedIn. It's interesting, but it is a platform which is also very commercially driven. It's owned by Microsoft, which is, a giant in the digital field, which I would say, do we need another platform run by a giant? Well, competition is better than no competition, so fair enough. But one just has to know that in the moment you enter LinkedIn, you enter the space of Microsoft with all the downsides this has, and the nature of who posts what. If you compare Mastodon to LinkedIn, is very clear. On LinkedIn, it's very commercial. It's about selling, training, selling expertise, consultancy. I'm the greatest speaker. Please invite me. This type of thing. While on Mastodon, you find much more academics, civil society, journalists who are interested in a genuine debate and not in self-marketing for commercial purposes. I think this is how I would define the difference of the space between LinkedIn, which is, of course, first of all, a database of people, of self-description, of CVs, which serves recruitment of staff, but which also serves basically selling yourself on the services market, on the labor market. And they have built up the content activities in a way which I have to say sometimes I find interesting, but there is a lot of quasi-advertising content there, which, all these newsletters where people wait to convert to some kind of commercial product. They fix you onto it, and then you have to pay this or that, or people want to be you move to their commercial course of training of this or that. So, there's a lot which diverts from the concentrated debate which policy making and democracy require.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting because LinkedIn is taking, I would say, a slightly different role in some of the conversations that perhaps used to be on Twitter. I believe that in the end, it's always going to be a mix. You're going to have some conversations on LinkedIn. I think Twitter will be there playing its part, and potentially, I think Mastodon might take a niche conversation with, as you said, more specialized, more academic people. And the thing about business models, I think, is we're still at an early stage because advertising is not the only business model. Elon Musk is trying the €8, the registration blue tick thing, but then you see The Economist, a lot of online publications have done a successful transition to subscription. So I think that might be something that people are going to consider. Now, you mentioned Microsoft, and of course, there's another massive transformation taking place right now, which is around artificial intelligence, I think manifested by OpenAI and ChatGPT, which is the one that everybody has been talking about in the last couple of months. Now, how interested are you in those technologies in, first of all, serving the conversation in the EU, and I guess also with some potential limitations and questions on legislation? But how excited are you about AI and ChatGPT? Have you been playing with it?
Yeah, absolutely. I have been playing with it, and especially the regenerate button, which allows you to get different answers to the same question. And so I would say that, let's say, from a technology point of view, and for simple text production, it's quite fascinating what these systems bring up. But at the same time, everybody can try this out. I tried it on my co-author of our book on power, democracy, and freedom in the age of AI. Unfortunately, only exists in German, this book. I tried on him, who is Matthias Pfeffer and what are his opinions? And the machine gave a grammatically, absolutely fluently coherent text, but in substance, it said things which were very wrong. And I actually also was introduced by someone recently at an event, public discussion based on a text which that person said came from GDP, and it was also old information. It was not up to date. So what I would say is this machine assembles the content from all over the world, but it doesn't do what journalists should be doing, namely check twice, two sources. At least, that would explain why there are mistakes. And also, if you ask a more philosophical or scientific question, and you get a text reply, which then sounds like a scientific text, you get no footnotes. There is no source referencing in GPT, and I think that's a problem. Because in a certain way, when the text is not just a journalistic text, and journalists, very rarely give footnotes, but sometimes they do actually. They if they quote somebody, they say who they quote. But beyond that, if the text becomes more of a scientific text, then I think we must apply the simple rule that in the digital world, the same rules should be followed as in the analog world. And in the analog world, every human being who writes a text where ideas and judgments and opinions of others are taken on, they footnote to the source to make clear whose idea, whose opinion, whose research, whose writing is referred to here and has inspired the text. So that's what I would now expect as the next step of GPT, that we know, if necessary, in every sentence, where do they take it from? And that is, as fascinating as the natural language output is, the great disadvantage of GPT compared to Google. Google at least gives you the links in the search. GPT gives you nothing, while producing a language which sounds very authoritative and self-assured. And so I think this is one of the first improvements I hope for, that at least there's a function which allows me to choose whether I want the footnotes or not. But if I want the footnotes, that I get them, and that I know where they get the content from in terms of facts, but also in terms of the opinions they propagate.
Yeah, I think it's going to be very interesting to see, how Microsoft integrates OpenAI in Bing, which is something that we should be seeing, I think, in the next couple of months or at least this year. There's already some apps, and actually I was testing one that you can put on ChatGPT with a web search, and that actually gives you some references. I think it's much less exhaustive than it's not a full integration. It's somebody who built that on top. But I think what you're saying is possible, because I think the technology would allow you to do it, but it's still early days. Now, one of the things that I think could be very interesting is, imagine if you take all the content of what the EU is doing, the policy documents, the research, all the things that they're doing, and you feed it into a kind of AI system and allow people to have natural language conversations. Now, of course, you have to make sure that it gets accurate and that it's well done. And sometimes that depends on the input. So imagine that you can more limit the input to known sources. Do you think that there's a potential for enabling a conversation on what Europe does and what different EU institutions do for the public, and maybe in multiple languages? Do you see that as a possibility?
Well, I can say that first of all, in terms of multiple languages, the language service of the European Union is the biggest in the world. We have many more official languages than the United Nations. I would also say that the communications capacity, also in terms of technological understanding the relevance of networks and platforms and so on, is quite high in the Commission. So I'm pretty sure that colleagues there are already looking at this potential and at this idea to feed, let's say, a calibrated version of GPT only with EU materials and maybe related texts, so that people can have a very concentrated and focused discussion on and dialogue with this system. I think that's certainly something where I would say within the next years, that's something which should be looked at. And I'm pretty confident, actually, that the colleagues here in communication are starting to think about this. This being said, I think, as much as the ability to formulate grammatically good text and also in terms of the flow, nicely readable, we have to rethink the concepts of public speech in light of the arrival of this machine. I mean, for example, until now, our assumption was that the discourse in democracy is among people, among voters. This is now going to change. It will be machines which are part of the discourse. So I think it's very, very important that all texts which are produced by this machine, whether they are sent by the machine directly into the communication and into the world out on the platforms and so on, or by people, need to be marked as machine text. Because otherwise the public discourse among people who have to vote in the end in democracy doesn't function anymore. If we don't know anymore whether the millions of praising texts for this or that candidate in the elections come from people or machine, we have a problem. So it's very important to create transparency here. And this is also partially the intention of the regulation on election advertisement on the internet, which we are bringing through the European Parliament and the Council right now. And another issue which I think we will be faced with is the question whether the right to an opinion, the right to free speech, is actually grantable in legal terms to the same extent like to humans to a machine. and I'm particularly here thinking about judgmental opinions. We grant human beings the right to say strong words about another person and to have an opinion about which this other person may be very upset. But that's free speech as long as it's not a blatant lie, as long as it's not slander or libel or something like that, or hate speech for that matter. But is it right to grant that possibility also to a machine? That's why I did ask in the test of the machine the question, who is Matthias Pfeffer and what are his opinions? Because the description of the opinions, as we then saw, Matthias and me, we looked at all the different types of answers we got from ChatGPT, and they were very judgmental and very much wrong in their judgment. So I think the legal future issue, which will be a high-level fundamental rights issue, is, can we grant a machine a right to have opinions, even radical opinions, in particular on people? Or is that a problem in our system of free speech, which of course relates to democracy, and also a problem for human dignity? My view continues to be that even if technology becomes ubiquitous and we live in a very technologized world, humans as subjects cannot become an object of machine control, machine manipulation, or for that matter, machine judgment. So I would say ChatGPT and GPT and Microsoft would be very well advised to be very careful in developing this machine as a judgmental machine. I think whenever judgment and opinion comes into play, this machine should be restrained, and the code should be designed in such a way that, by all means, it always refers to opinions to others, but it should not be allowed to create its own opinion, especially not judgmental opinion about people.
Some very, very deep thoughts to unpack here. I think we'll be continuing that conversation online, because I think it's a lot of very relevant topics that will become more intensely discussed over the coming months. But first, we have time for some recommendations. So, Paul, what are your recommendations for our viewers this week?
Yes, I have one recommendation, which is the newsletter of Azim Azhar, who writes from London, an ex-economist, journalist, and his newsletter is called Exponential View. I think it's, for me, the best newsletter on new technologies, AI, but also other new technologies, because while being extremely accurate and forward-looking in understanding the technologies and the markets, at the same time, Azim Azhar in his newsletter has a section on sustainability and cares a lot about the good functioning of democracy. So I think he strikes the right balance between, let's say, technology and commercial and company reporting on the one hand, but also the necessary critical distance to these interests. Great newsletter, comes out on Sunday. In addition, he has podcasts and other interviews during the week. So that's my recommendation, Exponential View.
Fantastic. We will be checking it out and sharing more on this. Lyra, your recommendation is somewhat different.
Yes, I want to recommend Flagey, Plus Flagey, because we all know you can have good food and drinks there. But of course, it also hosts a popular performing arts center for music, film, and festivals in a big Art Deco building. And I like going for concerts there. Mozart's Requiem is playing there. It's being performed there tomorrow on Saturday. And so I also want to recommend Mozart's Requiem, which, by the way, is all about life and not death. You might know that Mozart didn't get to finish it because he died while writing it, just about finishing it. So someone else had to finish it. He also had 7 children, and 5 died when they were babies. So he had a lot of experience with death, and it's just a magical piece. So if you don't get to see it here in Flagey, because there's now a waiting list, go see it somewhere else, because it's always better to listen to classical music in a concert hall. Of course, there's a choir in this Requiem, and it's just a fantastic piece. I mean, I can continue talking about this, but I just recommend this music hall. There's also a jazz concert coming up, I think on the, let me check that for you, on the 8th, so next Wednesday, from Abdullah Ibrahim. He's from South Africa, which is also supposed, I don't know him, I've just listened to him. It's also supposed to be quite magical. So there's some tickets available for Wednesday for a jazz concert from Abdullah Ibrahim, and also some other interesting pieces. So check out the Flagey list and go see some music. You come back a different person, I promise.
Yeah, and Flagey has a fantastic venue for that. So I think that's amazing. My recommendation is actually the Great Mental Models series. This is actually book 3, and it's from Farnham Street. It's basically about all the mental models that we can use to better understand the world. But it's a beautiful book with really nice, thick, with illustrations, and I love the idea of just learning to think better with different mental models. So that's my suggestion. You can check the blog, which explains the approach to mental models. Now, that's all we have time for this weekend, so we will continue that conversation online. Paul, great to have you. Great to hear your views and insights, and looking forward to seeing you on Mastodon, Twitter, LinkedIn, and anywhere else we can continue this conversation. Have a fantastic weekend.
We want to have coffee.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Right.
Bye-bye. Have a good
Bye-bye.
weekend.
Bye.
Have a great weekend.